one of the things I want to start with is, why did I write a second book? And this is something that comes up a lot. And we were joking before I came on here that, like, I could probably write a dozen books on this topic. Like, I mean, for the average person, it's like, oh yeah, well, like, learning better, like, how much is there to know? And it's like, you have no idea. There's so much stuff out there that there could easily be a dozen books written on that topic. But that point aside, I feel like these two books are very complementary, but also distinct. Ultra Learning was really quite a personal, sort of subjective book. It was capturing a lot of the projects that I did and people like Tristan and others who were very focused on intensive self-directed learning. So people were taking these intense, compressed projects where they were learning something difficult in a short time frame. And in the process of researching that book, I was coming across some of the cognitive science literature, some of the educational psychology literature, some of the research that sort of underpins how do people learn, what are the constraints, what do you need to do to get it right. And I dabbled in that. Like, there's definitely chapters in Ultra Learning where I talk about research. There's chapters that were, entirely based on research, like the chapter on retrieval, or chapters where I'm talking about spacing effect and this kind of thing. But it was sort of one of those things that where you whet your appetite and then you get more interested in it. You get sucked in. You want to keep talking about it more and more. And so I spent a couple years reading literally, like, probably close to 1,000 academic papers, hundreds of books, just immersing myself in this to try to get a picture of not just, what is this weird corner of the internet doing to get good at certain skills in short frames of time, but how does learning work in general? And I was very interested in particular, not just on, again, the experiences of a few unique and exceptional individuals, but what are the general ingredients that you need to make learning happen? And I mean, it is complicated. There's lots of little parts, but the principles that I ended up summarizing in this book, and I've broken them down to these 12 maxims, which each cover sort of an area of research and idea, is seeing, learning from other people; doing, learning through practice; and feedback, learning from experience. And so these three elements are very important for learning. They're essential for learning most skills. And so I'm looking forward to talking to Tristan a little bit more, introducing you guys to this conceptual structure that I think is very powerful for understanding, again, not just how one person did something impressive, but how all learning works everywhere.
Yeah. What what I found fascinating when I read the book is there were constantly moments where I'd recognize something that I was doing that I didn't know I was doing, or
Yeah.
I was just reassured, oh wow, at Ultraspeaking, we do exposure therapy. Clearly,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's all about putting yourself out there and being there. And so there's consistently, as I'm going through, I'm reassured by a lot of things, but I'm also constantly shown nuances and variance in what the research shows that I was underlining like crazy all the time. And so we
Yeah.
pulled out three of the maxims that I think apply particularly to ultra speaking and to this
Mhm.
community. So maybe we can jump into one from each section. So for the
Yeah.
the first section, which is C, we picked out chapter 3, which is success is the best teacher. And I find this one really fascinating because I think it's a piece that most people don't think about, or most people would
Yeah.
that never even wouldn't wouldn't include in their learning journey. Can you tell
Yeah.
us about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, so I like this. I like this maxim because it's one of those ideas where the sort of contrarian advice has become so prevalent that sometimes, like, saying something that's fairly obvious becomes itself contrarian advice. So the idea is that if you are in the self-improvement kind of milieu, or you're in this sort of advice space, a very common mantra is failure is the best teacher. We learn from our mistakes. It's, you need to have these kind of struggles and difficulties and all sorts of, harrowing experiences in order to succeed in a domain in the eventual result. And so I wanted to argue, push back on that a little bit, to argue that actually, when we are encountering new domains, it's important to start with success. And this is for two reasons. The first reason is cognitive or intellectual, that when we are starting in a new field, we don't often have the building blocks that we need in order to succeed in it. So I use the example in the book of learning to read, which is something that we all take for granted. Most of the people here, I'm assuming, know how to read, and you do it so automatically. You don't even realize the amount of cognitive work that goes into decoding black little squiggles on a page and hearing words in your head. And the research, and this is because this is such an important skill that is, it's the backbone of our education. It has been very well studied. So we have a very good picture of what works for learning to read. That is maybe not true of a lot of other skills. Like I don't know of a comparable research for like public speaking, for instance, unfortunately. And one of the things that we find from that is that being able to break down systematically the skill and having this sort of built up approach where you learn, you learn all the letters, you learn the sounds the letters make, you learn to blend the letters together, all these sort of little myriad parts really facilitates learning to read. And the kind of throwing people in the deep end and letting them figure it out is not usually an effective approach, despite the fact that that actually approach has been dominant in educational practice for better part of the last century. So this first idea of cognitive, starting with the right foundation, learning the right prerequisite skills, I think is very important because we often reflect on, why am I not good at this? Why am I struggling with this? And a very quick rejoinder is I don't have the talent or I don't have the aptitude for this. When very often what we're lacking is background knowledge and background skills. So I'll tell a little story about that. I have a friend and she's a fairly high up manager level engineer at the civil engineering company now, and she did a master's in civil engineering where she did some thesis on like fluid dynamics and how it affects like hydroelectric dams, and so really easy stuff that everyone can get right. And she told me, and she was telling me this in all earnestness. This was not like this is not a humble brag or some kind of like false modesty or something like that. She said, well, I took an intro computer science class, like an intro computer programming class in university. And I took the class and I just realized, you know what? I'm not smart enough for this class. And I just thought that that was very interesting because this is what she inferred from taking this class is that I go in the class and I see the other people around me and they're getting it right away and it's hard for me. And because they're getting it right away and it's hard for me, I must not have the right mental equipment to succeed in this domain. But what I think she probably didn't appreciate is that like 90% of that class were probably a bunch of nerds who did a lot of programming in high school. And because they did a lot of programming in high school, when they take the intro programming class, they already know a lot of the material. And because they know the material, they are able to learn the new stuff a lot faster. And so this is the importance of background knowledge, the cognitive component of building from success, that we want to build the right foundation. So if you're reflecting on your public speaking journey, for instance, it's important to realize, you know what, if I feel awkward on stage or if I feel like I have difficulties or I'm not as charismatic, and you're comparing yourself to someone who maybe has gone on stage every day, or they are a college professor and they stand up in front of a classroom and lecture for hours at a time, you have to realize that that difference in background knowledge, that difference in background skill is not necessarily an indication that you lack talent or lack ability. So that's the first part. The second part is motivational. So it is true that when we are on a long journey toward mastery, failure and setbacks and overcoming difficulties is important. However, the way our motivation works is that we are a creature that is designed to choose things to specialize in, to choose little niches where we will be successful in our tribe, where we will, find a job where we will be rewarded. And our motivational hardwiring seeks out, therefore, the situations where we seem to be doing better, the situations where we seem to be progressing faster than other people, or where we are getting rewards more easily than we thought we could. And so this presents a difficulty when we start learning in a new field, is that if we throw ourselves in the deep end and we throw ourselves in a situation where we do not experience success, we experience a lot of negative feedback, a lot of negative reinforcement, it's very easy to get this idea in your head, I can't do this and I'm going to give up. Excuse me. So I believe that it's very important when we are starting out to look for those environments which are going to be supportive and encouraging us to invest the time so we can build those background skills and knowledge so we can develop. So I think, Tristan, to use the example of what you were doing, Toastmasters is sort of the paradigmatic example of this for public speaking. Because if you've ever been to a Toastmasters meeting, people are, they're not yelling at you. They're not like booing you off the stage. They're very congratulatory, even if your speech was in fact boring and you had a lot of pauses and you're not very charismatic. People are encouraging, they applaud at the end regardless. And is that always what you need to advance as a speaker? No, probably not. It probably helps to go at the comedy club open mic and get booed off stage. But maybe not in the beginning. And so I think when we are developing new skills, branching into new territories, figuring out how we can find that environment where our skills and our motivation, our self-efficacy can be nurtured is very important.
So fascinating. There's so much there that I would love to unpack. I have a lot of thoughts on the question of talent,
Yeah.
and I'm curious because I guess this has to come up a lot. Okay, it's a skills things, but where does talent come into play?
Mhm.
Natural ability. What do you think
Well,
about that?
so there's two answers to this. So one is it is sort of broadly speaking, are some people going to have an easier time learning any particular skill or subject than others? And I think the answer is unquestionably yes. I get this question thrown at me a lot, especially, taking on those intense projects in my early 20s. There was a lot of like, oh, well, I would never be able to do that. So like kind of what's the relevance of your advice if you're some sort of, weird, weird learning freak or something like this? So I do think there probably is a sense in which, I'm never going to be shooting 3-pointers like Steph Curry or going in the Masters like Tiger Woods. I'm not going to have certain raw abilities that other people have. But I think there's a reason that I don't really like the concept of talent. First is that talent's kind of a residual concept. It's sort of like what you subtract away once you remove like the obvious advantages. So if you were to take a math student who's in grade 9 and a math student who's in grade 12, and the grade 12 person scores much better on the grade 9 homework, you would just say, well, but yeah, but they're not the same. You're comparing apples and oranges. You're comparing someone who has had 3 more years of instruction. However, we can count the years of instruction in grade school. We can't easily count the influence of background knowledge. So taking it back to reading again, what we were talking about earlier, because again, there's been such a huge amount of research here. Some students enter the first grade classroom having parents who read to them with shelves of books at home, and they have a concept of reading. They know what print is. They've learned their letters. And other kids live in homes where, there's not a lot of books. There's not a lot of value for reading. They don't know which way a book opens or any of these things. And so really the deficit of background knowledge is much higher. Now, this is pretty much equivalent to the grade 9 or grade 12 student, but we can't easily measure it. We don't always have a way of quantifying that when the person comes into the classroom. And so, from that perspective, it's easy to just say, oh, well, the people who came from the more affluent, literate households, they're just more talented. And so I think the issue here is not that there is no such thing as talent or no such thing as some people being innately better at other people, but just that it's very difficult on an individual level to know whether or not your advantages are because, of some raw immutable ability that you have, or just that, you've spent a lot longer exposed to information or skills that are actually relevant to that skill.
Yeah, I love that. That's very similar to what I've been thinking. Let's move on to number two, do. In
Yeah.
do, I selected the difficulty sweet spot.
Yeah.
And that's something I'm very interested in. Tell us a
Mhm.
little bit about that.
Yeah, so first is a little bit of background. The idea of see-do feedback and how this kind of emerged from the research is that as I started working on the book, I was very interested in practice. That was a big part of ultra learning. It's something that definitely, like when I was doing my projects, doing a lot became very important. Like you don't want to just be like sitting back and watching videos of great speakers. That's not going to make you a great speaker on its own. And so I even, thought of taking this to an even further extreme. Like practice is the main thing that we need to do. And the thing that emerged from the research which was very interesting to me and somewhat surprising, was that yes, practice is important. I don't think anyone really denies that, but that learning from the examples of other people is also super important. And in some cases, if you don't have access to people to learn from, if you don't have the right examples to learn from, you can do an enormous amount of practice and not make any progress. So in this chapter, I use the story of Octavia Butler. She was a MacArthur Genius Grant winning science fiction author, and she has books that are taught in college English classrooms, very successful. But if you look at her backstory, it's actually it has some elements of kind of tragedy in it. This is someone who struggled really hard for a very long time to make it in her field. And a major reason for that was that she wanted to be a science fiction writer, but she didn't know any science fiction writers. She didn't have any mentors, any peers, any people who could explain to her, this is how the business works, this is how you have to write, this is what's working in your writing, this is what's not working in your writing. And that lack of examples, that inability to see, really hindered her. And so what we see in this sort of situation is that when you are doing practice, yes, you want to have you want to be challenging yourself so that you're pushing yourself to go forward. So I also use the example in the book of, you can get stuck in certain phases of your development where you don't work on harder projects, and that delays your growth. So in Octavia Butler's case, she was working on short stories for a very long time. And she kind of got stuck there a little bit because the novel was too long. She wasn't sure how to bring a story across that long a period of time. But it was writing novels that actually launched her career, that actually made her successful. And so you can see this sort of delay where she's just sticking to short stories because that's what she knows how to do, but it's not enough to pay the bills. So she's working these, blue collar jobs, waking up at 3 in the morning to go work at a factory. This is a hindrance because it's not hard enough. She's not pushing herself. But then you can also see the opposite problem where she is not in an environment where she has examples to learn from. She doesn't have anyone she can emulate or imitate. And so she's also in a situation where the difficulty is too high. She's trying to produce things and it's not working out, and she doesn't know what she's doing wrong. So again, the research shows that there's like this kind of nice zone where you want to be difficulty wise, where if it's too easy, you're maybe not going to be progressing fast enough through the skill. You're not going to be taking on challenges you need to grow. But if it is too hard, then you are not going to be making growth as well. And so one of the ways that you can work on that, and I talk about in the book, is this idea of a workshop method where you are seeing examples, getting practice, and getting feedback in these tight feedback loops, which allow you to sort of fine tune the difficulty. If it's too hard, you see more examples. If it's too easy, you push yourself to do harder projects, things outside of your comfort zone.
Mm. So what about the environment? If I'm thinking about speaking specifically,
Yeah.
let's say somebody comes to Ultraspeaking and they have extreme anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
So when they show up to a class at first, they're barely able to access their working memory because there's just so many symptoms, right? But pretty quickly, they're going to start feeling more and more comfortable and make incredible progress in a short amount of time just because of the exposure therapy, which we'll talk about in a second, but just also getting in the reps and the anxiety goes down. Eventually, if they keep at it, they're going to get to a point where they feel comfortable in this environment. So comfortable that we're not emulating the effects of that, the outside world anymore or as effectively. And in a situation like that, how can you think about the difficulty sweet spot? I know that in this book on anxiety attacks, the author will have her patients, she's a psychologist, will have her patients like actually like blow into a straw and get aroused their body to a point where they're going to feel symptoms so that they can experience like, but what are other ways in which you could do this?
Yeah. Well, so I think there's two reasons you want to raise the difficulty, because this is actually like a bit of a philosophical point. Like, why would you want to increase the difficulty? Like, it's sort of obvious why you might want to reduce the difficulty, because it's like if you can't succeed, you need to make it a bit easier. But why would you want to increase the difficulty? And I can think of two reasons for that. So the first reason is simply that you're trying to learn a sort of progression of skills, and so there's an endpoint, which is a more complicated skill, and that's the goal. So if you're learning mathematics to be like a PhD holding mathematician, for instance, if you can just get stuck at grade 9 algebra and you just keep repeating that, you're never going to get to your destination. And so you can think of this in an emotional context. So if we're talking about anxiety, for instance, if your goal is to be able to like deliver elevator pitches to like Shark Tank, right? And you just stay stuck in the Toastmasters, nice long clap break after everything you say environment, you are never going to totally rid yourself of that anxiety, because you need to be in more threatening situations in order for that to go away. That's a sort of an emotional reason. But even just the skills of being able to quickly reply to someone, to work through what you're working on an idea, those are all very important. So in this sense, you can sort of see like if there's a progress bar for a skill where you start and there's like very basic stuff that you're trying to do, and there's very complicated stuff. And if your goal is to get to the complicated stuff, you have to move from A to B, and you can get stuck because you just never progress beyond that. So that's the first reason. The second reason, and this is sort of a little bit more complicated, but the idea is that as we learn most skills, one of the common cognitive processes is that we start to automate parts of the skills. So the best example of that is, let's say, driving a car. When you drive a car in the beginning, you're very conscious of where you put the hands on the steering wheel, and how you're going to move the gears, and where the brake pedal and the gas pedal is, the signal. You're very, very conscious of that. It's a slow, methodical process. It's not very fluent. And as you keep practicing, it becomes more and more automatic. And that's because part of your brain sort of automates some of these tasks. You just don't even think about turning on your signal when you do a turn. Your just brain says, okay, I'm making a turn, and then the signal goes up. You don't have to make a very deliberate effort to do that particular action. And so this slow automation of the skill means that in some ways you kind of lock in whatever you were doing when you were learning. So whatever process worked in the beginning, you're locking it in. And that can, in some cases, make your performance more fluent, more automatic. Certainly for public speaking, that is an advantage, because what we prize in charismatic speakers is their fluency, their self-confidence. But it can also mean if you have certain problems with your performance, certain things that you do that are distracting or not very helpful for your communication goals, you're sometimes locking those in, and you're making it so that you rely on doing that all the time. And so this idea of deliberate practice, which we can talk about as well, is based on the research of Anders Ericsson, was that when performers reach this really automatic stage of processing, often to make improvements, you have to make the situation more difficult so they cannot rely on the automatic components of their skill. So you have to go to a special environment to drive your car where you're not able to do the things that you were doing automatically. So if I drive here in Canada, I rented a car when I was with my wife on vacation in Italy, and I got to tell you, taking the roundabouts in Florence was definitely not a feeling of automaticity. You're like, oh my God, are these cars going to smash into me? That is a feeling where now I'm in a new environment that's more difficult, that's forcing me to be more conscious, more deliberate, to maybe fix mistakes in my performance, maybe fix things that I'm doing wrong. This is something I do as a writer constantly. I have been writing for almost 2 decades. It's very fluent, very automatic for me, but often the fluent automatic writing I produce is not the best writing I'm capable of. And so doing writing projects, writing essays where I have specific constraints that are going to force me away from some of the sort of easy outs, easy habits I have for producing prose, is going to end up elevating my craft. So this end product of getting better is often requires you to make things more difficult, again, to overcome this sort of tendency towards automation, this tendency to just do whatever you learned in the beginning faster and more effortlessly over time. So these are two different reasons that you might want to be upping the difficulty.
I think we might come back to the writing part at one point, because I think I saw a question related to writing, but we'll keep that for the end.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the last one, feedback.
Yeah.
In this one, I think this is very obvious. In this chapter, I found just magical. Fears fade with exposure. This is wonderful because I think the research is very unequivocal here.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is. This was a chapter that when I encountered the research, so I encountered the research. It's always good to cite your sources. I encountered the research through a book by the psychologist Stanley Rockman called Fear and Courage. Great title for an academic book, by the way. And he opens, and he talks about a lot of stories from people in truly harrowing circumstances, but he opens with basically the worst failure of psychological prediction, perhaps in history. And this was on the eve of World War II. A lot of the planners in England were thinking, now the technology is improved, that Germany is likely to drop bombs on London and major populated centers. And if you've never, even contemplated this before, a natural and understandable response is that this is going to cause mass panic. I mean, if I think about bombs falling on me when I'm sleeping, it doesn't make me feel at particular ease. And so I discuss, and Stanley discusses as well in his book, just the numerous examples of people who made these outsized predictions of how much there would just be breakdown, panic, and this panic and breakdown in the sort of psychological fabric of Britain's society was going to be much more damaging than the physical damage. So it wasn't so much even that, a few people would die or a few buildings would break down, although there was quite a bit of that, but just that this would so wreak havoc on the minds of the people who were there that it would just cause a breakdown in society. People would be fleeing, trampling over each other, having mass panic. And the real sort of crazy thing about it is that this didn't happen. That in fact, people got used to being bombed on a regular basis, to hearing air raid sirens, to seeing craters in their backyard, to witnessing things that, for someone who's never been in an active war zone, just seem unimaginable to me. And Stanley Rockman sort of takes this as an example of where psychologists mispredicted this, is that they imagine that when you would be experiencing something that's very stressful, fearful, it would sensitize you. That this is a common belief people hold now, that if you experience something stressful, if you experience something that's going to be, maybe a little bit scary, that it's going to sensitize you, make it harder for you to deal with those situations in the future. And the research seems to be that in most cases, it's the opposite. In most cases, as we get exposure to situations, our fear tends to decline. Now, oh, excuse me.
Bless you.
Still have a little bit of a cough there. Most cases, our fear declines, and there's a lot of interesting sort of little neuroscience about this, because a lot of the cognitive skills, a lot of stuff that I spend a lot of time talking about in the book, we know most of our information through psychology, psychologists who are doing, experiments with human beings. But this is actually an area where we have a lot of neuroscience data, because the structures of the brain that are involved in processing threat detection are relatively simple. They're relatively open to animal models and experimentation. So I also highly recommend Joseph Ledoux's book, Anxious, if you're interested in getting into the nuts and bolts of that, because, we have like basically circuit diagrams of like, this is where the information of the threat gets processed, and, how it gets sent up to the higher orders of the nervous system and stuff. So it's very fascinating, but this basic principle of exposure has been, I would say, widely recognized by researchers, by clinical psychologists, but it's maybe not as understood popularly. Again, we live in an era where the focus is very much on avoiding things that are going to potentially be scary or trauma-inducing or these kinds of things. And I don't want to say that those are always wrong, but it is definitely a case where I think the research and public perception are at odds.
Can you talk about, and we have about 3 minutes before we move to Q&A, but I found the contrast between habituation and extinction
Right.
really interesting. Can you tell us about that?
So this comes from animal models where you're running an experiment, and these are like the classic behaviorist experiments. And so habituation is when something unpleasant happens and you keep doing it, and the response to that unpleasantness kind of diminishes over time. So if I took like an air horn, one of those really loud things in a can, and I like did it behind your head, you'd probably do this, right, when I do it the first time. But if I did it like every 5 minutes for about an hour, I mean, you probably hate me, but you wouldn't jump as much each time, because part of your nervous system is sort of expecting it, or at least not responding to it as much. The second thing is extinction. Extinction is different. Extinction is when you condition some expectation. So, every single time you type a letter on your computer, maybe I've hooked it up to some like machinery, and you're going to get a little zap. And there's a little zap there. And so I press the L key. Zzz, zzz, zzz. And if I were to do that repeatedly, I would learn an association that like pressing the L key is going to cause a zap. And so maybe I have some fear. My palms are getting sweaty even before I press it, because I know the zap's coming. But then I stop doing it. It stopped zapping. And so the extinction is this process of, once something has been conditioned, you are now removing the conditioning because you're learning a new experience. So I used the example of like the comedy club in the book, where the idea of extinction is going up on stage and realizing that being booed off stage is not actually that likely. Like you go up there and you don't actually get booed off stage. So you're learning something new about the environment that you thought You know, touching the L would zap you. You thought going on stage would result in getting booed, and then it's not actually happening. And so you decondition your fear that way. And habituation is just being booed off stage every night and realizing that, you know, it doesn't bother you that much. So those are two sort of ways that through extinction and habituation that our nervous system sort of adapts to these fearful situations with reduction in anxiety.
So what I find fascinating when it comes to speaking, more than I think close to 70% of students who join Ultraspeaking have anxiety as number one or number two
Yeah.
in the reason why they're joining. I feel all kinds of symptoms. My brain races, and I dislike that. I want to get rid of it. So you do exposure therapy, you put yourself out there, that gives you habituation and extinction. If you're going through Ultraspeaking, you're getting access to both. But what's interesting, I'd love for you to share a little bit about
Yeah.
the two memory view, because what's
Yeah. Yeah.
happening is you're not getting rid of that fear, you're doing something different. And that has a very important consequence, I think.
Yeah. So it's interesting. This is like one of the reasons that I love going into the research, because you find these nuances that you would never be able to just infer from your like casual experience. And so one of the, I think, common perceptions of when you're thinking about extinction, even the word extinction implies like a dying of something, right? So when you think about, my fear is getting extinguished, you're imagining there's some part of your brain that encodes the threat detection, the fear of public speaking. And that when you're getting exposure, it's like withering. That's the sort of a mental model you could obviously have. And there's some research that shows that that's not actually what's happening. That what happens when we are getting exposure is that you're learning a new memory. And this new memory is that I'm actually safe in this situation, and it suppresses the fear memory. And how do we, like, what's the difference? Is this just semantics? This is like, what is the practical consequence of that? Well, unfortunately, the practical consequence is that the learning of safety is less robust than the learning of fear. And well, I'm saying learning of fear, but I mean, for public speaking, there's a real argument about whether it's a learned fear or something that is hardwired. I mean, I bring up the example of, you know, many people are afraid of snakes. Snake phobia is quite common. Even people who are not snake phobic often don't love snakes. And how many of us have had a snake bite? Almost nobody, right? So we've never had a direct personal experience which would indicate to us that snakes are dangerous and they should be feared. On the other hand, I am not afraid of electrical outlets. But I have been zapped before. So that is something where we often don't have a fear, even though many of us have had, you know, shocks and various things that would maybe condition us to fear electrical outlets. So the idea here is that whatever the origin of the fear, whatever the origin of this particular, you know, neural circuitry, whether it was learned or whether it was just something that we were born with or developed naturally out of our genetic programming, the circuitry that controls the fear and the circuitry that controls learning safety maybe are separate. And the way that you can kind of tell the distinction is that often, and this is found in exposure therapy and the research on it, is that you can train someone to reduce their fear, and then later the fear will pop back up again. So there's a few situations that can happen. One is if you change the context. So you learn to speak confidently in your Ultraspeaking group, and then you go up on the road at some corporate event where you're giving a speech, and all of a sudden your heart's palpitating. You feel fear again, which you didn't have at all. Maybe you'd completely extinguish the fear inside that group. So context change. Second one is time. You know, to use an example, you mentioned my story of learning these languages. And the funny thing about it is, like, even now reflecting on it, it sounds kind of crazy. But when we were doing it, after you were spent even like a week or two in the country, you have zero self-consciousness about being really bad at this language you're speaking. You feel just totally natural going up to strangers and barking, you know, barely comprehensible Portuguese at them. Whereas now, I still learn these languages. If I have to just suddenly start speaking Spanish or Korean or one of these things, you know, not only is there some memory rustiness, but there's definitely some emotional rustiness that I have those same feelings. Again, because the safety memory is a different memory than the fear memory, so it can wear off over time. So you need to have like spaced exposure over time to continue to inoculate yourself in this way. And then finally, external stressors. So just experiencing something really stressful in your life that produces a lot of negative emotions can sometimes knock off the learned safety in other areas. So this is a little bit disappointing. It would be nice if it was the first model where you just extinguish the fear.
Indeed.
But I think this is where understanding the research can be really beneficial because it lets you know, okay, I'm doing this ultra speaking. I'm going to be in an environment where, if I do it intensively, I will decondition the fear relatively quickly. But how do I keep it that way? How do I maintain that so that in my life, 10 years from now, I still feel the same way? And so just taking little preventative measures, I think, can be a real help if we understand this science.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay, I could keep asking questions. I still have 100, but we have a bunch of questions from the Ultra Speaking community. Ryan's been gathering some of the questions. Ryan, do you want to take over?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to invite Farhan to come on camera and ask his question. It's one of the most recent questions in the chat. So Farhan, step up if you would.
Hi, Scott.
Hi.
So this is a question. So can you mentally rehearse in your mind, mimicking an ideal case for mental exposure? So it's kind of like how athletes kind of think of winning a race.
Like for fear and
practicing
anxiety,
the-
is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, like public speaking, things like that.
Yeah, so it's actually interesting. I don't go into it in too much depth in the book, but there was this whole school of thought for therapy for phobias and stuff called flooding and implosive therapy. And I forget whether it was flooding or implosion. I'm mixing them up. They were similar, but one of them, the whole idea was it was all imaginal. So you're not actually facing your fear. It was just the therapist like really working you up. So if it was like you had a fear of, I don't know, I apologize to anyone if anyone has any phobias here, but like if you had a fear of spiders, it'd be like the therapist just like describing, you're like sitting on the couch and he's like describing your body's covered in spiders, they're biting you, this like, and you would just be like, having almost a panic attack. And the thing that was found from this research, which I don't recommend this particular strategy, by the way, of like, having someone yell terrifying things at you. But the idea here is that before this therapy came out, before this was an issue, there was a mixture of, well, is it the case that what we need to do is just very gradually build up? Because if you give someone too much fear, it's going to like this sensitization, desensitization, that kind of balance. Versus, should you give them the scariest possible situation right off the bat? And I tend to lean in favor of the first one for pragmatic reasons, just because it's very difficult to get people to do exposure if the idea is that like, I'm afraid of heights, so let's go jump off a plane. I think that's not really a successful strategy, practically speaking. But just theoretically, it turned out that that exposure kind of sort of works in both cases. Like there was examples of success in both cases. And so the imaginal exposure, the imagining things, I think is valuable for situations where it's very difficult to get real exposure. I think it probably doesn't work as well because obviously it's not real, right? So that, okay, people booing me off the stage and I'm imagining it is going to get my stress level up like maybe to a 3 out of 10, but being booed off stage is going to get me up to a 9 out of 10. So I think it's probably the case that it doesn't work quite as effectively, but I do think visualizing things can be helpful. And I'll give one quick story because I know I don't want to be spending too much time on each question, give people a chance to ask, but I've always had like a mild fear of heights, like just from being a kid. And when I turned 30, I did bungee jumping, and I knew that I was going to do this, and so I had this kind of like, oh, this is going to be really like scary in my head. And so I remember kind of mentally rehearsing, okay, I'm going to be standing there and I'm going to walk off and jump. I'm going to standing there, I'm going to walk off and jump. And doing that rehearsal meant that when I was on the platform to do the jump, I didn't freeze up. I did it. Now the terror came later as I was falling, but that rehearsal I think can help you get through, not only because it makes your response more automatic, so it's more habitual, you're less likely to like hesitate, but I think it can also temporarily reduce your anxiety in that moment because, again, you've experienced a little bit of exposure, so it probably helps. So long answer, but I hope that helps.
Thank you, Scott.
Awesome. Cool. Great question, Farhan. Next, I'd like to invite Sneha, hope I'm saying your name right, to ask your question to Scott.
Hey, thanks. Hey, Scott. This has been incredibly useful, and I've already made tons of notes. So my question is, what suggestions would you have for helping children or young adults reframe from I'm not good at this to, oh, I can learn anything if I learn how?
Yeah. Well, I think so the research on motivation and learning is very interesting. And I think there's a couple factors that stand out to me. So one is this idea that we are sort of inherently drawn to making these comparisons. And so I used the example of my friend going into the computer science class and being like, I'm not smart enough to do this, which was just like so absurdly false given the other things that she had done intellectually. Um, but how could she have gotten that belief? And it's because we naturally put ourselves in some reference class. And when we feel like we're not doing well in something, there's a sense that it's kind of rational for us not to invest a lot of time. Maybe I have some distribution of talents. I may be more artistic than musical. And if I go to the painting class and the teacher's like, wow, you are the best in the class, and I go to the, playing the recorder and it just sounds like a cat dying. I mean, maybe there's some reason that I should spend more time on art and less time on music because there's only so much time to do certain things. So I think when you want young children, you want them to succeed in a domain. I think also trying to avoid situations where they're going to be in this direct ranking, direct comparison, which is unfortunately the entire education system. So that would be the first thing. The second thing I think is, again, going back to the original point, is that whenever anyone's struggling, we need to go back down and look at what's missing. What are they missing in their foundation, their repertoire that needs to be built back up? And so the research on learning to read is very strongly supportive of this, that you have students, some of them maybe have greater natural ability than others. I don't deny that. But there's also huge gaps in terms of how literate the household they're coming from is, how much exposure they have to print, to books, to many of these ideas that they will be learning in school. And the method for getting those students up to date is to try to fill in those background holes, those things that are missing. So that would be my recommendation, is that if I had a child who was struggling with something, I would be looking for like closer to like what's the sort of direct instruction, really rigorous curriculum, so they can build up that confidence, build up that fluency. And you see this with a lot of programs like Kumon and those kind of things. They kind of are doing that. They're trying to like really get a lot of practice at these basic building blocks so that the students can be fluent and thus be more confident in their classes. And so I think the real thing is just like when you're approaching a new skill or subject where maybe you have some difficulties, to figure out what are those building blocks, what's missing, what needs to be practiced.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
I was muted. Ryan, who's next?
Oh, wow. That was cool. I think our award for the most questions today goes to Linda F. in the chat. Linda, you had a great question about age. Would you please ask Scott your question?
Yes, but I just want to really quickly talk about serendipity. I read your book several years ago. I didn't know anything about Ultraspeaking or Tristan, but I was really interested in his story. And then I found Ultraspeaking and found Tristan. So I'm a huge believer in serendipity. Sorry about my dog. So here's my question. I'm 70 years old. I am the most curious person I know. Is there expiration date on ultra, or is it like age agnostic?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I did a research for an essay, and maybe someone on the team can like pull up that link. But I think it's something like, how does age change how you learn, on my website, where this was a number of years ago. I did like a review of a lot of the research and tried to summarize some of it. So a couple of things that I took away from it, first of all, is that there is maybe some decline in people's cognitive performance, ability to learn over time. So I think that is probably true, but it's not as dramatic as people often make it sound. I think that oftentimes it's the social environment that reinforces this more than anything. I had a conversation with someone who was saying, how did I learn to play the instrument so much better when I was 12 than I am now? And this person wasn't even that old. And then we're digging into this conversation, and he's like, "Oh yeah, but I didn't have any responsibilities or any other jobs or anything when I was 12, and all I did was play the instrument. And now I'm like lucky if I can get like an hour in a week." And you're like, the explanation, it just finally arises. And so I think sometimes when we have not been in a learning environment for a long time, maybe we've spent a lot of time out of school, we're not in this intensive environment, it can feel a little bit awkward. Certainly, if you're older and then you're going to like a college campus with a bunch of 20-year-olds, you're going to feel a little awkward. Or if you're starting to learn a new skill and you have had lots of decades of experience being really good at the thing that you're good at, but you're learning something completely new, that can also create some momentary feelings of awkwardness or discomfort. There is some interesting research on how aging affects cognition, and probably just helps to do the practices that work well, and just do them more. I think the advice is very similar for ADHD and learning to focus, for instance, is that like all the things that work for people who need to focus, the sort of tools of like, organizing your environment, turning off your phone, putting things away, those things tend to be even more important for people who are in that environment. So I think for people who are older, the techniques of good learning, the practices that are involved in good studying, spacing, retrieval practice, having a very structured curriculum, breaking down all of these things that I talk about, in some ways are more important. That the sort of smarter, more naturally clever you are, the more you can kind of like do things not very well and still succeed in some pursuits. So I do think there's probably some things that are going to be getting harder, and you have to always calibrate your expectations based on your own personal experience. But I don't think there is a real sharp change in method that like, okay, well, these things work when you're 20, but they just don't work at all when you're 70 or 80 or 90.
Thanks. That's very encouraging. Thank you.
Thank you.
Scott, we have a question from Roddick about things outside of learning that we do. Go ahead, Roddick.
Cool, yeah.
Yeah, right. So, Scott, I have a question. Let's say I'm learning something, let's say for several hours, and then I do some other activity which is not very good cognitively, like scrolling TikTok for, bless you, for another several hours. And my question is if this like mental garbage accumulation after the learning phase, like if it affects the actual learning, and if so, then like how much or...
That's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I think there's definitely some things, there's some things that you can do that would make learning worse. So going out and drinking a lot of beers after you study is probably not going to be super helpful. Things like sleep are very important for learning. So I would ask you, what are the things you're doing? So if you studied from, 4 p.m. till 10 p.m. and then you spent 5 hours on Reddit waiting until the night and you got bad sleep, well, that's going to affect memory consolidation. So that's going to impact your ability to learn things. There's probably some like nuanced kind of, the ratio of like doing something and then doing something else and then sleeping might affect learning. But my feeling is less that there is some sort of direct negative impact of the mental garbage, as you call it. But I do think there's something motivationally where, reading books, studying, doing this kind of practice is often more mentally difficult, more challenging, less immediately viscerally rewarding, even though it can be more satisfying in the long run than, just surfing Twitter or what have you. And so I think this sometimes affects our motivational hardwiring, that I think it's sometimes difficult to focus, sometimes difficult to stick to doing something hard when you're regularly going back and forth between, something that's not as hard. So definitely when I'm in book mode, I have to do a lot of reading. I try to curtail a lot of that other stuff because I find it makes it harder for me to like sit through and read dense academic books. So you have to just decide that for yourself. I don't know any particular research that like, you're consuming low quality information is like impairing your ability to learn, but there might be some mechanism there.
Great. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was awesome, Scott. Now I wish
we done already? Are we
7 hours
through the whole hour? Oh my God. Sorry guys, I should have been faster. I should have been speaking at 2 times the speed and then we could have covered more stuff.
we have to end on a high.
Yeah.
So, well, first of all, I'm going to share this link. I really recommend that everyone purchase Scott's book, Get Better at Anything. I truly, thoroughly enjoyed it. I think it's going to just light your brain on fire and get you so motivated to up your learning and dive deeper into it. And I know there's a bunch of questions that we didn't get to answer, but Scott is a prolific writer, so there's a lot that you can get. I also encourage you to sign up to his blog and newsletter, because there's just always an incredible amount of very valuable content. Scott, is there anything else or anywhere else that you would send people if they want to dig deeper?
I mean, my website, scotthyoung.com, we've sort of been talking about it. Like, I've been writing essays there for decades. We mentioned even just that article where I covered the research on aging and cognition. So there's lots of little things like that. Like, I have a complete guide to motivation that's like almost book length free thing where I cover all the science on motivation. So if you're interested in these topics, if you're even maybe only 10th as interested in these topics as I am, then hopefully there'll be something there that'll be useful and new for you. So I recommend checking it out. And of course, the book. And then if you haven't read it already, you can read Ultra Learning. I think chapter 4 was a particularly good one. So.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I'm very, very grateful. Thanks for your time, Scott. This has been incredibly valuable, and I know that everybody here enjoyed it, and we're gonna keep this as evergreen content for the community, because I think there's a lot to learn here.
Oh, thank you. You know, it feels like a homecoming for me. I feel like Tristan and I, we've been so close. I've gotten really the privilege to sort of watch your journey from the guy who ran the French cashmere sweater startup to now you're the ultra speaker who, was so impressive. I'd dedicate a whole chapter to the book to you. So it's been a real pleasure working with you and having these conversations over the years.
Thanks, Scott. Now I'm rooting for you to write another book so I can invite you again and we can dig even deeper.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, everyone. Very
Thank you.
appreciative. Great questions. And I'll see you all soon.
Take care.